Welcome friends to another r/prorevenge video. Join me in getting revenge against the YouTube algorithm by helping out the video by hitting the like and subscribe buttons down below. That said, our first story of the day is by Nanobot0991, torture a student and lose your whole career in the process. I work in a healthcare facility with different disciplines, and we have the main clinicians and assistants as well that do treatment. For the longest time before COVID, clinicians would take students from schools because they need to have some hands-on experience before they graduate and get to take their state exams. So I'm the supervisor of the health clinic and in charge of all clinicians. Even though they're fairly independent, they have to report to me, and I turn and report for the whole clinic. This starts with Dory, a clinician teacher. She has a lot of friends in one of the prominent universities here. She's very well connected with them. She graduated from there. Dory's involved with their activities and just active in the school in general. I've known Dory for years and I've worked with her before, but she was never directly under my management because her home clinic was another location she would just help out. I would hear things about her, the way she treated the assistants that worked under her, a rudeness towards other clinicians, and some sketchy stuff about basically fraud of billing for services not rendered. This is a big no in healthcare, but it happens more than you think. Anyway, I had no proof of this, and all the patients at my clinic hadn't voiced any complaints. Anyway, Dory had started taking students in, and she was moved at my clinic. When she came there, she was still helping at another clinic not too far away. Dory accepted a student from her university to follow her and learn from her and slowly integrate into clinical treatment. This is where Hannah the student enters into the picture. Very shy girl, did everything you asked of her, but because she was shy and also being a new student, she's unsure if the treatment she's administering is the appropriate one. That's why you have people like Dory to be next to you and counsel and guide you. After the first few weeks, I started noticing Hannah would be in the clinic and would be doing treatments without Dory being around for a few hours. This isn't allowed because the instructor should be around at all times to supervise their students. After a few times of noticing this, I brought Dory and Hannah into my office and said this cannot happen and is not allowed. If it happens again, I would have to report it, and this wasn't something I wanted to do. If I did report it, the student would lose their clinical placement and would have to wait 6 months until the next placement, which pushes back the graduating date. A few weeks go by and things have been fairly normal. The student would be in the clinic sooner but would not be performing treatment. She would, however, shadow other clinicians. But Dory was still coming in later than usual. One day as I'm walking by Hannah, I see that she's on the billing menu. In order to be on that screen, you would have to be clocked in. Otherwise, the system wouldn't allow you to do it. I call her to my office again and I sternly tell her that I specifically said she couldn't treat patients and she doesn't have a clock-in username and password. Hannah proceeded to tell me that Dory had told her to clock in for her and start billing patients before services were rendered. This had been going on for the whole time she had been a student. Now, I don't see the billing until the next day, but I don't have a clock of when the billing was submitted. I tell Hannah that this was strictly not allowed, but I need more information before I make a decision. I call Casey, the other clinician, into my office, and she proceeds to tell me that Hannah goes home crying and bawling every single night due to Dory threatening to fail her as a student, as she didn't do all those things for her. Dory had used her leverage in her school to strong-arm Hannah into doing all her work while she wasn't even there. I asked Hannah if this was true, and she said yes it was. Hannah then goes on to tell me that after the first time meeting with Dory, Hannah, and OP on what they shouldn't be doing, Dory brought Hannah to the side and told her, "He's cool, he knows what's really going on, but he has to say that as a manager, so keep doing it." At this point, I asked the student if any of her evaluation or letters of progress had been submitted to her school so they know she's been making progress. Hannah says that Dory has never submitted the necessary paperwork to the school and has gotten away with it because of her connections to the school. So if I fired Dory, she would in turn take revenge on the student and fail her at her clinical. She would be 6 months to a year from being placed into another clinic, meaning she would be either very late of just failing and not being able to graduate. I called Katie and reported everything to her, told her my fear for the student and the constant trauma she was going through every day, crying, being threatened, and retaliated against. Katie was also fearful of this, but also worried the liability this put on the company, also how long it had been going on. So she didn't have an answer on how to handle the situation without harming the student. So here was my revenge. I started watching everything Dory did. Treatments, time and complaints, etc. One weekend, Dory had to work without her student on a Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. When I come in on Monday, I notice a patient having been to the hospital since Friday, but still had been billed for services. I checked the clinician. It was Dory. How was she able to treat a person that wasn't even in the clinic and also be able to bill her? So I had my reasons to fire her. I had the evidence I needed, but I still wanted a bit more. I texted Dory and asked if she had seen said patient. She reported yes she had, but also asked if she had billed less than what she should have because she would have been able to bill more if I wanted. I told her that wasn't necessary and that there was no way to bill more due to the patient being in the hospital the whole weekend she had billed. She knew from that moment what was going to happen. The next day, OP and Katie waited for Dory and she was fired on the spot, just for the fraud. The student thing never came up in conversation, and she had no idea we had known for a while. I had another clinician write up a whole letter on what the student was doing and that she was a good clinician and had completed the necessary work to be able to graduate. Dory was unable to get any more work after that because the incident had been reported to the government and had that on her license wherever she went. Her new employers would look at the license and not want to hire someone with that on their record. Last I heard, she was working at an Amazon warehouse as a manager. From a doctorate degree to warehouse manager, after many years, I'm sure, of fraud and abuse. The best part is the student had graduated, gotten her degree, and is working in the field. She's a great clinician, has done great work in her field, and I still keep in contact with her. She's very thankful for being pulled out of that situation. If you were working someplace, maybe in a manager position, and you knew somebody like Dory was holding the success of a collegiate kid beneath them in their hands, making them do everything for them, would you stick your neck out there like OP did and find any way to get that college kid out of that position? Let me know in the comments down below. Our next story is by I Hate People Too. This one's hilarious. To all musicians, read your contracts and pay up or else. I work in music production. I charge $125 an hour to edit, mix, or master recordings from bands, which is about half the average rate. I had a band come to me. I mixed their album. It took me 10 hours. 10 times 125 is 1,250. Well, at the end they said, and I'm not even joking, but this is so ridiculous, well, an hour only has 60 minutes in it, not 100, so your math is wrong and unfair. I was stunned, because how can people in their 30s be this uneducated? I said, it doesn't matter how many minutes are in an hour, I charge by the hour, and you agreed to it. They had signed a contract. Well, they left and refused to pay. This was their debut album/EP, and little did they know, they didn't read the darn contract, that I saved the backups of all the work I did, and there was a clause that says my studio retains ownership of 100% of the music that I work on until I am paid, and sign the rights back off to the band. Again, this is very boilerplate contract stuff in music industry. They had planned on selling their CD at concerts for $20 each. I released their music free online, every site I could find, and I also knew the venues they were playing at. So I made 1,500 CDs, it cost me like $200, but worth it for the spite, and every gig they had, I would set up a booth with their CDs just outside the property line of the venue and give their CDs away for free, acting like an agent of the band. One thing they also never planned on, I made the vocals on the CDs off pitch with auto-tune. The band broke up about 6 months later, after people stopped going to see them. I love absolutely legal revenge. Me and my two friends who helped me had a heck of a laugh. Like, we were giddy the whole time this was going on, it was great. Pay up or get screwed. This is the kind of thing like web designers have to deal with. They spend all these very talented man hours creating these layouts, creating these designs, and then people just try to block them out and ghost them and act like everything will be okay. And 99% of the time, the people who do these things, they're smart, they've been doing it for a while, they still have access to the website, they'll just take it down or completely ruin the design and say, pay your web designer. If anything, maybe OP should have gone and labeled the CDs with some kind of like, debut album name, didn't pay the mixer, or something like that. Our next story is by an anonymous poster. Neighbor called the cops on my dog, so I'm abusing a loophole in the local law. My neighbors lived next to me for a few years and was always a friendly guy. I recently adopted a dog that had been abandoned in my neighborhood. We live in a small neighborhood away from people. I guess it seemed like a safe place to dump a dog. Now the dog for the first few days was a handful, barking a lot if I left the house to go to the store and climbing the fence to run loose. Now he's fine. I took him to a trainer for the barking, installed a taller fence with coyote rollers, and reinforced the gate. The day of my issue was when my grandsons opened the gate, let him out, and didn't tell me he had gotten out. I realized about 30 minutes later, looked around the neighborhood, and found him beside my neighbor's house with the trash knocked over. Well, crap. So I got the dog on a leash, knocked on the guy's door, let him know about the trash, and seemed fine. I picked up the trash with my grandson, had a talk with my grandson, and mowed the guy's yard as an apology, making sure to clear it with him first. All is good, right? Nope. That night I have a knock on my door, couple of badges to write me a citation for dog at large. Guy had it on camera, called it in sometime, and said he was pressing charges. A $135 ticket and some young cop chastising me for 10 minutes later, and I'm pissed. I'm really mad. So I called the police and asked about noise ordinance laws in my town. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. they say. I went to the other 2 houses in my neighborhood, asked them what time they woke up, and decided on a plan. That night, I went to Best Buy, bought 8 of the loudest sound systems they had, and went home. The next morning at 6:01, I had them hooked up to my extension cord and next to the fence facing his house. I turned them on to classic rock and sat down with a cold beer and cigarette. A little later, the cops are at my house, noise complaint. I remind them that the noise ordinance says 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And I know the rest of my neighbors are already awake or at work and okay with this little revenge. No law I'm breaking. They try to tell me to turn it off. I mention the fact that there's no general nuisance law in town. Maybe they shouldn't elect judges based on popularity contests, huh? They ended up leaving in defeat. That time and the 4 other times he called them. So far, this has been going on for 2 weeks, and my wife thinks I'm taking it too far. I think having my dog threatened to be taken from me was taking it too far. Personally, my wife's using headphones at night, one neighbor's at work during this time frame, and the other neighbor looks like the crypt keeper and is as deaf as a bat. I'm ready to go until they change the laws, until I disturb someone I care about, or until he moves. So I will say that in this situation, OP's dog getting out, knocking over the guy's trash, definitely bad on OP's part. But the fact that OP was willing to go pick up the trash, mow the guy's yard, clean up any of the mess, and the fact that this was a one-time thing, it wasn't like this dog was getting loose every weekend, the neighbor is a bona fide jerk for calling and pressing charges. At some point, all this noise revenge does get overkill, but if OP's got nothing better to do, maybe the neighbor shouldn't have been a jerk. Maybe the neighbor should go over there and apologize. Extend an olive branch, I don't know. Although considering the reaction of the neighbor, I doubt either side's going to want to apologize for anything. And our final story of the day is by Butterfly Chunks. I retrained my roommate's brain to not respond to his alarms. I was in college, senior. My roommate was a sophomore, but it was his first time living in a dorm. He'd been a pretty lousy roommate, constantly leaving the room a mess, left his stuff on my side of the room and on my bed, stole my alcohol, used my stuff without my permission, never cleaned up my dishes after he used them, and a bunch of other stuff. I confronted him about all these issues, and on several occasions got the RA involved in the alcohol stealing issue because, at the time, he was under 21. Things still continued anyways. He asked me once if I was okay if his girl spent the night, which I said no. We were in the middle of a pandemic, plus that's especially weird if I was there. I also had to wake up every day at 8 for work, which he knew, and he would stay up until 2 a.m. playing video games some nights. Not to mention, he would set like 10 alarms in the morning with a bunch of different alarm tones. I hit a breaking point and decided to do something cruel. Every morning when I'd woke up, I'd observe his alarm pattern and how he'd respond. He had several alarms that he'd ignore, all with the same sound. He had a couple half-hour alarms that had a unique sound, also ignored, and then the final alarm had its own sound too. All of them were default iPhone sounds. So his brain had been trained to this alarm pattern for a while, I'd assumed, so I started step 1 of the punishment. Set up a sequence of alarms on my phone identical to his sequence, but an hour early. He responded to my alarms the exact same way he'd responded to his own. I kept this up for a week, and his brain was eventually retrained to sleep through double the amount of alarms as before. Then, phase 2 kicked in. Random inconsistencies in my alarm pattern. Some days I'd play all the alarms, while other days I'd only play one that his brain was trained to ignore. That way, his brain expects to sleep through like 20 alarms and only ever hears 11. He slept through his alarm at least 4 times in 2 weeks. Eventually, he finally changed his alarm pattern so he'd only have one alarm and he no longer had the energy to stay up until 2 a.m. I kinda feel the roommate's pain though. I'm awful at convincing myself to get up at the alarm, so I end up setting like 4 alarms before the final time, where I have to get up. Honestly, it's something that I do need to improve with. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So of all these stories I've read today, which is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't yet, if you could like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. Whatever you do, whether it's liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, all of it helps grow this channel and I appreciate the heck out of it. So until next time, I'll see you all tomorrow with some more stories.